In Luke chapter 17, we find ourselves in a parallel place to Matthew 18. Jesus is talking about forgiveness in community. He says that if someone sins against you 7 times a day, and each of those 7 times they come seeking forgiveness, then you keep forgiving. This lines up with several of the elements from Matthew. But then, in Luke's gospel, Jesus launches into a parable that is not about forgiveness, but rather faithfulness in serving God. He says, "But which of you, having a slave, plowing and shepherding, will say to him, when he comes in from the field, 'Come at once and recline at table,' and will not say to him, 'Prepare something for me to dine on, and gird yourself, and wait on me while I eat and drink, and after that eat and drink yourself'? Does he give thanks to the slave because he did the things that he was commanded to do? So you too, when you do all the things commanded of you, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done what we ought to do.'" This passage is technically understood as a parable, but it could also be seen as a question about normal everyday life, as many people in the ancient world would have come home and instructed their slave to prepare refreshment. The surprise or twist in this parable is the suggestion that the slave would be thanked for their service. An owner of enslaved persons wasn't under a cultural obligation to say thank you to their slave because their slave was simply doing their job. They didn't need to be thanked any more than you would thank your toaster for toasting your bagel. Remember, a slave is considered as less than human. They are merely a helpful piece of property in the household. Jesus' question, does he give thanks to the slave because he did the things that he was commanded to do, would have assumed a resounding no. Therefore, God does not thank us for our service. And here is the crux of this parable's meaning. In this passage, Jesus explicitly identifies us as the slaves of God. Jesus says, "So you too, when you do all the things commanded of you, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done what we ought to do.'" In this parable, we are the worthless slaves who are to be obedient to our master. We are going to see this over and over again in the sessions that are to come in this course. We are God's slaves. Again, I will note that this is a striking and controversial metaphor. It is most shocking given our more modern history of enslavement in our country. But for the first time in this course, I want to point out some parallels. While God as master and us as slaves is jarring, God as king and us as subjects is common. We have a whole Sunday in the church year given over to Christ as king. And while our modern connotations with royal families are more fun and interesting because of the intrigue and pageantry, we all remember from our basic history classes that kings and queens in the ancient world, all the way up to the late medieval world, were despots. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of action, no rights as we are familiar with them. The ruler ruled, and that was it. As a subject of the monarch, you were completely subject to the monarch. It wouldn't be until the 13th century AD, with the drafting of the Magna Carta, that kings and queens began to be subject to laws instead of serving as the incarnation of the law who determined right and wrong. We're all very familiar with the metaphor of God as shepherd and us as the sheep. Similarly, the sheep have no say in the governance of their life. They don't get to decide that they will go to some other field or choose some other shepherd. The shepherd doesn't take a vote amongst the flock. The sheep don't get to decide when they will be shorn or when they will end up on the dinner plate. The shepherd is the despot of the flock, and the sheep are subject to the shepherd. We have a different concept of parent and child relationships today. Sometimes children can end up running the house, and they definitely aren't seen and not heard anymore. But in the ancient world, the father ruled the house, and children were to be thoroughly obedient. And children were considered to be several rungs down the social ladder, above slaves, of course, but not by much. We see this several times in the Gospels when people bring small children to Jesus and the disciples are aghast. They think that Jesus is way too important a person to be bothering with kids. So the standard metaphor of God as Father and us as God's children also has a similar connotation to God as Shepherd and God as King. So metaphors which highlight the total control of God and the total subjection and devotion of God's people are not limited to slave and master. They are abundant. And this might just be the main gist of this metaphor that we need to hear. We can tend in modern Christianity to see the relationship with God as something less than total devotion. In fact, we can begin to think that God is sort of like our errand boy. When we see prayer as giving a list of things that we want God to do for us, then what does that say about how we understand God? When we see God's job as simply blessing us, giving us our best life now, we lose the whole notion of our complete devotion to God. We turn the relationship around, looking for what we can get out of it instead of what we are being asked to give. We'll run into these questions over and over again in the rest of this course.